She woke to the same golden light, the same quiet hum of the kettle, and her dog curled at her feet, just like before. But this morning wasn't like before. Months ago, her husband had sold her beloved dog without her consent, shattering her trust and setting off a battle she never expected to fight. Now, in a new home filled with peace instead of tension, she finally has him back. How did she go from heartbreak to this quiet victory, and what did it cost her to get here? Before we continue with this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel, as we have a special story that'll be released soon. The kettle clicked off with a soft pop, sending a thin ribbon of steam curling upward into the kitchen's pale morning light. Claire wrapped her hands around her favorite mug, the one with a faded print of wildflowers along its side, and felt the warmth seep into her fingers. The house was still quiet enough to hear the soft ticking of the wall clock, the faint hum of the refrigerator, and the steady breathing of the dog lying just behind her chair. Milo's head rested on his paws, his ears twitching occasionally at some sound beyond the window. His golden coat caught the sunlight in a way that made it look almost brushed with fire. Every so often, she reached down to ruffle the fur along his neck, feeling the steady weight of him against her leg. It was a ritual they had formed over the years. These mornings together before the rest of the day pressed in, she would make her tea, sliced a bit of toast, and Milo would settle nearby, not demanding attention, but anchoring her with his quiet presence. He had been with her through the move into this house, through a long illness that had kept her in bed for weeks. Through the months when her husband traveled more than he was home, she spoke to him the way some people speak to themselves softly, without needing a response. He was constant, and she trusted that. From the hallway came the creak of floorboards, the sound of someone walking with a certain heaviness. Daniel appeared in the doorway, pulling on a shirt as he spoke into his phone. His voice was low but urgent, the words clipped in that way he used when talking about money or business. He caught her watching him and gave a tight nod, ending the call with a quick "I'll handle it." The tone was brisk, closed off. "You're up early," she said, taking a sip of tea. "Couldn't sleep," he replied, moving to the cupboard for his own mug. "Too much on my mind." She thought about asking what it was, whether it was the repair bill for the car, the mortgage payment, or the job he'd mentioned he might not keep past winter. But the slight set of his shoulders told her he wasn't in the mood for questions. Over the past few months, more and more of their conversations had gone like this. Brief exchanges. Nothing too deep, a polite dance around topics that might cause friction. Milo stood and patted over to Daniel's tail. Giving a cautious wag, Daniel reached down and patted his head without really looking, the gesture quick, distracted. Milo returned to Claire's side, leaning against her knee, as if confirming where he belonged. She finished her tea slowly, listening to the small sounds of the morning, the low hum of Daniel rinsing his mug, the faint chirp of birds outside, the occasional soft thump of Milo's tail against the cabinet. Everything looked the same, but something in the air felt different. She'd been noticing it more lately, a quiet tension that seemed to seep into the corners of the house. Daniel gathered his keys and phone from the counter. "I'll be out most of the day," he said. "Don't wait up if I'm late." She nodded, watching him leave. The door shut behind him, the sound echoing faintly through the quiet rooms. Milo looked at her, ears pricked, as if asking what came next. She smiled faintly and scratched under his chin. "Just us for now," she murmured. The morning stretched ahead, familiar and ordinary. But beneath the routine, beneath the steady comfort of Milo's presence and the soft spill of sunlight across the kitchen floor, there was a current she couldn't quite name. Something had shifted, and though she didn't know it yet, this would be the last morning the house felt this way. The scent of toast drifted through the kitchen, mingling with the faint aroma of brewed coffee. Claire sat at the table with a folded section of the newspaper, though she had been reading the same paragraph for several minutes without really absorbing the words. Milo lay under the table, his back pressed against her feet, a steady warmth she had grown used to. Outside, the morning was still pale, the light filtered through a thin veil of clouds, casting everything in a muted glow. The kitchen, with an energy that felt too fast for the hour. He buttered a piece of toast, glanced at his phone, set the toast down without taking a bite, then opened the refrigerator as though looking for something he knew wasn't there. The clink of jars and bottles was louder than necessary, each sound sharpening the space between them. "You're restless this morning," she said, setting the paper down. He shrugged, not looking at her. just a lot going on. She waited for him to elaborate, but the words didn't come. Work, she asked. Work, bills, everything. He pulled the coffee pot from the machine and poured himself a cup, filling it almost to the brim. Things are tight right now, tighter than I thought. Claire studied him, noting the faint crease between his eyebrows. We've been through tight before, we'll figure it out. This time's different. He stirred sugar into his coffee with short, quick movements, the spoon clinking against the ceramic. The savings aren't stretching the way they used to. Costs keep coming, and something's got to give. She felt Milo shift at her feet, the subtle movement grounding her as the words sank in. We can cut back, she said carefully. Skip the vacation this year, hold off on the renovations. Daniel's mouth tightened. We've already cut back, and it's not enough. We've got expenses piling up, and I don't know, Claire. I'm looking at everything we spend money on and asking what's essential and what's just nice to have, the way he said. It made her uneasy. What exactly are you saying? I'm saying we've got to be practical, he replied, leaning against the counter with his coffee in hand. Not sentimental, not right now. Her gaze flicked to Milo, who had lifted his head at the change in her tone. The dog's dark eyes watched her, unblinking, as if aware that something was being discussed that involved him, even if he didn't understand the words. Sentimental, she asked quietly. Daniel hesitated, taking a sip of coffee before speaking. Again, we've got things we spend time and money on that don't really make sense when you look at the bigger picture. Vet bills, special food, all that. The air seemed to still between them. Milo is not just things, she said, her voice firmer now. I didn't say he was, Daniel replied quickly, though the glance he gave her was brief, almost dismissive. I'm just saying, sometimes we have to make hard choices. Claire felt a tightening in her chest. He's family. That's not up for discussion. Daniel's jaw worked as if he had something else to say, but thought better of it. He set his cup down, picked up his untouched toast, and finally took a bite. Chewing slowly, she watched him, trying to read the thoughts he wasn't sharing. Over the years, she had learned that his silences often held more weight than his words. This morning, they felt heavy enough to bend the air around them. Let's just eat, he said finally, as though closing the subject. She picked up the paper again, though her eyes stayed fixed on Milo's steady form beneath the table. There was something unspoken in the room now, something that made the clink of cutlery sound louder and the silence between their words stretch longer. She didn't know exactly what Daniel was thinking, but she knew it wasn't the same as her own thoughts, and that difference felt like the start of something she might not be able to stop. The afternoon sun slanted low through the living room windows when Claire pulled into the driveway. The house looked the same as it always did, from the outside quiet, still with the faint shadow of the maple tree swaying across the front porch. She balanced a paper bag of groceries against her hip as she unlocked the door. Already thinking about what she might cook for dinner, Milo would be there, she thought, tail thumping against the floor, head tilted, waiting for his usual greeting. But when she stepped inside, the silence hit her first. No nails clicking against the hardwood. No rush of paws toward the door. The stillness had an edge to it, sharp enough to catch in her chest. She called his name softly at first, then louder. Nothing. The groceries felt suddenly heavy in her arms. She set them down on the kitchen counter and moved quickly through the house. Checking the usual spots by the front door, the rug near the sofa, the sunny patch by the back window, his bed was there, tucked into the corner, just as she'd left it that morning, the blanket slightly rumpled. She knelt beside it and placed her hand on the fabric. It was warm. Her pulse quickened. She stood and scanned the room, half expecting him to emerge from under the table or trot in from the yard with some toy in his mouth. Instead, her eyes fell on the leash hanging from its hook by the door. It was still looped neatly, the metal clasp glinting in the dim light. She reached out and touched it, the cool metal against her fingertips, feeling oddly final. If Daniel had taken him for a walk, the leash would be gone. A thin thread of dread began winding itself around her ribs. She went to the back door and stepped outside. The yard was empty, the gate closed, the grass undisturbed. The maple's branches moved in the wind, casting restless shadows across the fence. She called his name again, her voice carrying over the quiet neighborhood. But no answering bark came. Claire went back inside and checked the rooms one by one: bedroom, bathroom, even the closet where he sometimes followed her when she put away laundry. The more places she looked, the more certain she became. Milo wasn't there. She reached for her phone, thinking to call Daniel, but stopped. Her thumb hovered over his number. She tried to picture him coming home with Milo trotting happily beside him, tried to make that the explanation. But something about the conversation at breakfast lingered in her mind: his tone. The way he had talked about hard choices and being practical. Her hands felt unsteady as she went back to the kitchen, opening the grocery bag without really seeing what was inside. The sound of crinkling paper filled the silence in a way that made it feel even more hollow. She kept glancing toward the door, as if sheer will might make it open and reveal him there, leaning into her hand the way he always did. Instead, she walked back to his bed and lowered herself into the armchair beside it. She stared at the rumpled blanket, the faint indentation where his body had been, and thought about all the mornings he had been there to greet her, all the evenings he had curled up while she read. The absence felt larger than the space it left. Behind, she pressed her palms together, willing herself to stay calm, to think clearly. Maybe Daniel had taken him somewhere, though where and why, she couldn't guess. She stood again, pacing the length of the living room, the leash swaying gently on its hook each time she passed it. It was as if the whole house was holding its breath, waiting for something to be said, something to be admitted. The sunlight on the floor shifted slightly as the minutes passed. She realized she had been listening not for the door to open, but for the sound of Milo's nails on the floorboards. The sound she now understood might not be coming back at all. The sound of Daniel's car pulling into the driveway jolted her from the stillness she'd been pacing through for the past hour. She couldn't yet name. The groceries were still in their bag, untouched. Milo's bed sat in the corner, the blanket smoothed out now from her restless fingers, running over it again and again. The leash still hung from its hook, catching the late light that slipped through the window. The door opened and shut with the usual weight, followed by the shuffle of keys on the counter. Daniel stepped into the kitchen, loosening his tie, his expression carrying none of the urgency that had been building in her chest since she'd discovered the house empty. He glanced at her, then at the groceries. "You didn't put these away?" he asked, reaching for an apple from the bag. "Where's Milo?" Her voice was steady, but it didn't sound like her own. Daniel bit into the apple, chewed, swallowed. "He's not here," like she'd asked something obvious. "I sold him." The words landed in the room without ceremony, flat and solid. She stared at him, her mind trying to make the sentence mean something else. "You, what?" A good amount for him, enough to cover the overdue bills and give us some breathing room. Her stomach dropped in a way that made her feel both weightless and crushed. "You sold my dog." "He's our dog," Daniel corrected, as if that made any difference. "And yes, I did. It's not like I just gave him away to anyone. She has a big property. Other animals, he'll be fine." Claire's voice rose, sharp against the kitchen walls. "You didn't ask me? You didn't even tell me you were thinking about it." Defensive. "If I'd told you, you would have said no. You're too attached, but we need to be practical. He's expensive vet bills, special food, the grooming. You know it adds up." She could barely hear the rest over the rushing in her ears. Her mind kept replaying the image of Milo's bed, the warmth still in the blanket, the absence she'd walked into. Practical. "You think selling a living being someone I love is practical?" Daniel rubbed the back of his neck, his patience thinning. "I think keeping a dog we can't afford, while bills go unpaid, is irresponsible. This helps us. I made a decision." "You made a decision for both of us," she said, quieter now, but with a steel edge he couldn't ignore. "You decided that he was a thing you could sell, like a piece of furniture." His eyes flicked away from hers, focusing on some point beyond her shoulder. "I thought you'd see it was for the best." Eventually, her hands felt cold, despite the heat building under her skin. She stepped back, the space between them stretching like a line pulled too tight. "With the new owner," Daniel said simply, as if that closed the matter. "She's already taken him home. There's nothing more to do." Claire felt her breath catch in her throat. The finality in his tone was meant to end the conversation, but instead, it routed her resolve. She didn't know how yet, but she knew. One thing with absolute clarity: this wasn't over. Milo was not just gone. The apple he had bitten into sat half-eaten on the counter. the pale flesh already browning. Claire stood on the other side of the kitchen, her hands gripping the back of a chair so hard that her knuckles ached. Daniel leaned against the counter, arms crossed now, his expression hardening into something she recognized all too well, a look that said he thought the discussion was finished. "You had no right," she said, her voice low but trembling with the effort it took to keep from shouting. "I had every right," he replied evenly. "We're married. The dog was ours. I made a choice for the good of both of us." Her breath caught. "You made a choice for yourself. You decided that my feelings didn't matter, that Milo didn't matter, because you wanted to solve your problem in the easiest way possible." "Our problem," he corrected sharply. "You think those overdue notices on the counter are mine alone. You think the power company cares about sentiment? This was a solution, Claire." She shook her head, feeling heat rise in her face. "No. A solution is cutting back, picking up extra work, selling something that doesn't have a heartbeat. A solution isn't getting rid of the one constant I've had in my life these past 5 years." Daniel pushed away from the counter, his voice sharpening. "You're acting like I did this to hurt you. I didn't. I did it because I'm tired of feeling like we're drowning. That dog costs money we don't have. You refuse to see that. Because you're too emotionally tied up in him." Her voice broke, but the anger underneath carried it forward. "Of course I'm emotionally tied up in him. He's my family. When you were gone for weeks at a time, he was here. When I was sick and couldn't get out of bed, he was here. You can't put a price on that." He sighed, looking at her like she was being unreasonable. "You're being dramatic. He's a dog, Claire. He'll adapt. He'll be happy where he is." That sentence landed like a slap. She felt her stomach turn, the air around them shifting into something unfamiliar. "And what about me? Do I just adapt to you selling my best friend behind my back?" Daniel's gaze hardened. "I'm asking you to be an adult about this. Sometimes we have to make sacrifices for the bigger picture." Her hands released the chair, and she took a step toward him. "You don't get to stand there and talk about sacrifice. You didn't sacrifice anything. You gave away something that wasn't yours to give. You didn't lose sleep over this. You didn't even tell me before you did it. That's not sacrifice. That's betrayal." He opened his mouth, but she kept going, the words spilling out faster now. "You've made it clear what your priorities are, and I promise you, mine are different. I will not accept this, Daniel. I will not just shrug and say, 'Oh well, because it's convenient for you.'" His jaw tightened, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. "What are you going to do? March over there and demand they give him back?" "If that's what it takes," she said, her voice like steel. For a moment, the room was silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. They stood facing each other like strangers, the kitchen between them feeling wider than it had ever been. Daniel picked up the apple again, more to have something in his hands than because he wanted it. "You'll see," he said finally, not looking at her. "This will be better for us in the long run." Claire stared at him, feeling the last thin thread of trust between them fray and snap. "You have no idea what you've just started," she said, and as the words left her mouth, she knew she meant them. Whatever came next, this moment had changed everything. There would be no going back. The moment Daniel left the house, the air seemed to change. It was as if the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting to see what she would do. Claire sat at the kitchen table, Milo's leash curled loosely in her hands. The metal clasp rested cold against her palm, a weight far heavier than its size. She stared at it for a long moment before reaching for her phone. She started with the local animal shelter. The line rang twice before a cheerful voice answered, asking how they could help. Claire explained in as few words as possible her dog had been taken, sold without her consent, and she was trying to locate him. The woman on the other end asked for details: breed, color, markings, any microchip information. Claire described him carefully, her voice faltering only when she said his name. The woman typed as she spoke, but after a short pause her tone softened. They hadn't had any dog matching Milo's description brought in recently. She suggested calling back in a few days. Hanging up felt like closing a door on a room she'd hoped might be open. She moved to the next number, another shelter, this one 2 towns over. Same questions, same answers, no dog, no records. By the 4th call, her voice had taken on a rehearsed rhythm, each word steady but drained of hope. She learned to listen. For the slight pause before the bad news, the almost imperceptible inhale of someone about to say no, she called breeders next. It wasn't likely, she knew, but she had to cover every possibility. Some were brisk, almost annoyed, explaining they didn't take in dogs, they hadn't bred themselves. Others were kinder, asking after her well-being before admitting they couldn't help. One older man, his voice gravelly with age, told her he was sorry and wished her luck. He added, almost in a whisper, that good dogs always find their way. Back home, between calls, she jotted notes on a scrap of paper, names, dates, the tone of the person she spoke to. Anything that might help later. The list grew quickly. Ink smudged where her hand brushed the page. She realized she hadn't eaten since morning, but the thought of food made her stomach turn. Next came the online ads. She pulled her laptop closer and began searching local classifieds, lost and found pet boards, and community marketplace listings. Her eyes scanned photo after photo of dogs, some too old, some too young, some the wrong shape entirely. She typed golden retriever into the search bar, then refined it by distance, narrowing it down to anything posted in the last week. That's when she saw it, a listing from 2 days ago. The photo was grainy, taken in poor light, but the tilt of the head, the dark softness of the eyes, was him. The description was short: purebred golden retriever, 5 years old, friendly, great with kids, serious inquiries only. The ad was marked as sold. Her breath caught. The post included no contact information beyond a username. She clicked it, hoping to find other listings, but it led to a blank page. She copied the image to her desktop anyway, enlarging it until the pixels blurred. Even through the distortion, she could see the familiar patch of lighter fur on his chest. She sat back, phone in hand, and thought about her next step. Whoever had bought him was out there, and someone knew how to reach them. She would find that person. She didn't care how many calls it took, how many closed doors she would face. The scrap of paper beside her was nearly full now, the edges curling where her hands had pressed too hard. She wrote down the time, the username, and the word sold in capital letters. It wasn't a lead she could follow immediately, but it was proof that Milo was somewhere, alive. Waiting for her to close the distance, she picked up the phone again and dialed the next number on her list. By late afternoon, her voice felt raw from repeating the same story over and over. The notes she'd scribbled on the scrap of paper were smudged from where her hand had rested on them. The ink dark in some places, faint in others. Claire had just set the phone down when she caught sight of movement through the kitchen window. Mrs. Hargrove, the neighbor from across the street, was watering the row of flowers that lined her front walkway. The woman was in her 70s, a widow with a sharp eye for anything unusual on their quiet street. If anyone had noticed something, it would be her. Claire slipped on her shoes and crossed the yard, the air cool and smelling faintly of cut grass. Afternoon, Mrs. Hargrove greeted, adjusting the nozzle on her hose. "You're out and about more than usual today." Claire forced a smile. "I was wondering if you saw anything strange this morning." "Around late morning, maybe." Close to noon, the older woman tilted her head, thinking, strange. "Well, I did see a car in your driveway for a while. Not one I recognized, dark blue, maybe a sedan. Had some rust along the bumper." She shut off the water and turned fully toward Claire. Man was driving it. "Didn't look like anyone I've seen at your place before." Claire's pulse picked up. "Did you happen to notice if he came inside?" Mrs. Hargrove nodded slowly. "I saw him walking back from your front door at one point, holding something in his arms. I thought it was groceries at first, but then I saw. Well, I'm pretty sure it was your dog, the golden one. He was in the man's arms at first, and then I saw him in the back seat when the car pulled away. He looked calm, not scared. I assumed he was going to the vet or something." The words hit her like a jolt, sharp, undeniable. "You're certain it was Milo?" "As certain as I can be from here," the woman said, pointing toward the driveway as though the scene might replay itself. "That patch of lighter fur on his chest is hard to miss. I noticed because he was sitting up in the back seat, looking out the window." Claire's mind raced. She pictured the blue sedan, the rust on the bumper, the image of Milo sitting there, unaware that he wasn't coming back. "Did you see which way they went?" Mrs. Hargrove frowned. "Toward the main road. I didn't see if they turned left or right, but the driver had short, dark hair, maybe mid-40s, wore a jacket, even though it's warm today. Didn't look like he was in a rush. Claire's fingers curled into her palms. "Thank you. That helps more than you know." "I wish I could tell you more," Mrs. Hargrove said, her voice softening. "I didn't think anything of it at the time. If I'd known," she trailed off, shaking her head. "You want me to ask around? Some of the folks further down? The street are home during the day." "That would be great," Claire said. "Anything at all, even small details." As she walked back across the yard, the weight of what she'd just learned settled over her. This wasn't some vague disappearance. Someone had come to the house, picked up her dog, and driven away in broad daylight. The pieces were starting to take shape. Daniel's calm dismissal, the empty leash, the photo in the online ad. Inside. She sat at the table and wrote dark blue sedan, rust on bumper, male driver, short dark hair, mid-40s in block letters on her growing list of clues. She underlined it twice, her pen pressing deep into the paper. She stared at the words, committing them to memory, already turning them over in her mind for the next step. There was no mistaking it now. Someone knew exactly where Milo was, and she was one step closer to finding them. The house felt heavier with each hour that passed, the kind of silence that wasn't just the absence of sound, but the presence of something unspoken. Claire sat at the kitchen table, her laptop open in front of her, the glow of the screen casting pale light over her hands. She had already spent most of the afternoon combing through local classifieds and pet rehoming boards, her eyes scanning each line of text with the same mix of hope and dread. She typed golden retriever into the search bar again, narrowing the results by distance, then by date posted. Dozens of listings appeared: puppies in need of homes, older dogs rescued from bad situations, photos of animals posed in tidy living rooms. She clicked through each one, looking for the familiar curve of Milo's ears, the particular shade of gold in his fur, the patch of lighter hair on his chest that had always made him look as if he were wearing a small, uneven bib dot. It was nearly an hour into the search when she froze. There, in a small, grainy photo, was a golden retriever sitting in what looked like the corner of someone's garage. The lighting was dim, but even through the pixelation, she could see the way his head tilted slightly to the left, the softness in his dark eyes. She knew that look: alert, curious, and trusting all at once. Her heart thudded in her chest as she clicked the listing. The headline read, "Purebred Golden Retriever, 5 years old, friendly, great with kids." The description beneath was short, almost casual: healthy, well-behaved male. Serious inquiries only. Rehoming fee applies. No name, no personal details, nothing that gave away where he might be. She scrolled to the bottom, looking for a phone number or email. There was nothing, just a seller username in small gray text, and beneath it, a single word in red. Sold. The sight of that word sent a wave of heat through her. Someone had seen the ad, paid the price, and taken him. It meant he was out there, alive, but also meant there was now another barrier between them. She leaned closer to the screen, studying every detail of the photo. Behind Milo wore what she knew was Milo. She could make out the edge of a cardboard box, part of a rake handle, a stack of plastic bins. They were ordinary things, but ordinary things belong to a specific place. She took a screenshot, then saved the image to her desktop. Zooming in only blurred the photo, but she still examined it piece by piece, searching for anything: a logo on the bins, a tag on his collar, even the faint outline of the garage door. She thought she could see a faint reflection in the metal clasp of his collar, but it was too distorted to make out. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard as she clicked on the seller's username. It led to a nearly empty profile: no other listings, no personal photo, nothing to give away a location. The account had been created just a week ago. Whoever had posted it hadn't wanted to be found. Claire sat back in her chair, rubbing her hands over her face. The image of him sitting there, looking toward whoever was holding the camera, wouldn't leave her mind. She could almost hear the soft whine he made when he wanted to be near her. That picture, marked with the word "sold," felt like a door closing in her face, but she refused to believe it was the last door. She copied the username into a document, along with the screenshot, the date it was posted, and the time. She added it to her growing collection of notes. The page now filled with small fragments: descriptions from shelters, the neighbor's account of the blue sedan. Now this listing. Closing the laptop didn't bring her any relief. The picture of him in that dim garage was burned into her mind, and as she sat there in the quiet kitchen, she made herself a promise. That word sold wasn't the end of his story. Not while she still had breath to fight it. Claire woke the next morning with the image of that grainy photo still sharp in her mind. She hadn't slept much. Her thoughts had circled the same track over and over, returning to the word sold in red at the bottom of the ad and what it meant. It wasn't enough to know that someone had bought him. She needed to know who. She moved quietly through the house, made a pot of coffee, and opened her laptop at the kitchen table. The listing was still there. She stared at it for a moment, committing every word and every detail to memory. She read it again and again, this time focusing not on the photo, but on the structure of the ad. The language was sparse, almost too careful. Healthy, well-behaved male. Serious inquiries only. Rehoming fee applies. It read more like something written by a seller who had experience, rather than someone simply trying to find a home. For a pet, she noted the seller's username a Gindan-descript, a jumble of letters and numbers that gave nothing away. Still, she copied it into a search bar, trying variations of it in case the same username had been used elsewhere. On the third try, she found a similar name on a local community board, tied to a different ad posted months ago for farm equipment. The contact method there was an email address. Her pulse quickened. She copied the email and pasted it into another search, narrowing it to public records. The results were scattered, but one listing linked the email to a small online payment account. She recognized the platform. It was one she had used herself before, and she knew that with the right steps, you could sometimes see partial transaction histories. She logged into her own account and navigated to the help section, scrolling until she found the page where users could request a payment reference if they had been a party to the transaction. She wasn't, of course, but she had enough details from the ad to create a plausible inquiry. She filled out the form, referencing the date and general description of the item in question, and sent it. Then she waited while the hours passed. She returned to the photo, scanning for anything she'd missed. In the corner of the image, where the light fell dimly against the wall, she noticed a shadow that didn't quite fit a pattern of slats, maybe from a partially open door. It looked like the type of interior door she'd seen in older garages, ones that had been converted to storage or workspaces. Her email notification dinged mid-afternoon. She opened it immediately. The payment service had replied with a partial confirmation, listing the first name of the account holder and the first 3 digits of their zip code. The name was Karen. The zip code narrowed the location to a cluster of towns about 20 miles away. It wasn't enough to walk up to someone's door, but it was enough to search with. She opened a map and began looking at the towns in that range, cross-referencing local directories for anyone with that first name who might match the profiler. Person who had reason to want a dog like Milo, who might have responded to an online ad quickly on a neighborhood bulletin site for one of the towns. She found a post from 2 weeks ago looking for a family-friendly dog, preferably golden retriever, to join our home. Large yard, children, other pets. The post was signed, simply, Karen M. Her breath caught. The timing fit. She wrote down the details, saving a screenshot, then checked the rest of the bulletin site. One of Karen's older posts mentioned living on the edge of town, near the old railway line. Claire leaned back in her chair, the coffee on the table now cold and untouched. The outline of the buyer was becoming clearer, no longer an anonymous red word at the bottom of a listing, but a person with an addressable life. She didn't yet know exactly how she would approach her, but she knew one thing. She was closer to finding Milo than she had been yesterday, and she wasn't stopping. Now, Claire sat at the kitchen table with her phone in one hand, Milo's old vaccination records in the other. The papers were slightly creased at the edges from being folded and unfolded over the years. The ink faint in some places where it had been handled too often. She traced the date of his last rabies shot with her fingertip, remembering the way he'd leaned against her leg in the exam room, trusting her completely, even though he hated the smell of the clinic. If the woman who bought him intended to keep him, she would need those records, and that meant there was a chance, small but real, that the vet's office would know who she was. She scrolled through her contacts until she found the clinic's number. As the phone rang, she rehearsed what she was going to say, careful to keep her voice even. The receptionist answered with the same cheerful tone Claire had heard on countless visits. "Hi, this is Claire Williams," she began, keeping her words. light, casual. I was hoping to schedule an appointment for my dog Milo, just a general checkup. It's been a while, and I want to make sure his records are still up to date. The receptionist tapped at a keyboard, the faint clacking carrying through the line. Milo Williams, Golden Retriever. That's right, Claire said, gripping the phone tighter. There was another pause, a longer one this time. Just HM. That's interesting. It looks like someone called last week asking about transferring his records to another clinic. Claire's heartbeat quickened. Really? That's odd, she said, forcing a small laugh. I haven't taken him anywhere else. I assumed it might be a change in ownership, the receptionist continued, sounding apologetic. They didn't have all the details, just his name, breed, and approximate age. Said they'd call back with more information once they confirmed the microchip. Claire kept her voice calm, but her mind was racing. Do you remember the name they gave of the person calling? The receptionist hesitated. I'm not sure I'm supposed to give out that information, but the first name was Karen. I didn't catch the last name clearly, but it might have started with an M. The name hit her like a jolt. Karen M., the same name she had found on the community bulletin board post the day before. The pieces were beginning to connect in a way that felt both exhilarating and terrifying. That's helpful. Thank you, she said, keeping her tone warm. I'll go ahead and set that appointment, just in case, for next week. They settled on a date, though Claire knew she might never need it. She hung up, setting the phone gently on the table, and exhaled slowly. Now she had confirmation that the buyer wasn't just keeping Milo quietly, she was actively establishing herself as his owner in a way that could make reclaiming him harder if too much time passed. She glanced down at the vaccination records still in her hand. They were more than just papers, they were proof. Proof that he had been hers, that she had cared for him, that she had been the one to authorize every treatment, every vaccine, every exam. And now someone else was trying to take her place in those files in the quiet kitchen. She opened her laptop and added the vet's information to her growing document of leads. Karen M., attempted record transfer, date of call. She typed each word carefully, as if making it real on paper would help keep it from slipping away. The thought of Milo sitting in a stranger's home, unaware of the small bureaucratic shifts that could decide his fate, filled her with a deep, steady determination. The vet's records were a thread, and she intended to follow it all the way to the end. The next morning, Claire decided she couldn't leave the conversation with the vet where it had ended. She called the clinic again, this time prepared to push just a little further. She knew the receptionist, Melissa, had always been friendly. With her in the past enough to ask about her garden or comment on Milo's polite manners during visits, if anyone might let something slip, it would be her. When Melissa answered, her voice carried the same bright warmth as before. Claire started the call casually, thanking her for fitting in the appointment for next week. She asked a few harmless questions about flea prevention, the kind of small talk that made her sound like any other client. Then, she steered the conversation back toward what had been bothering her since yesterday. I keep thinking about that call you mentioned, Claire said, keeping her tone light, almost amused. The one where someone asked about transferring Milo's records. You said her name was Karen, right? That's right, Melissa replied. Karen? She stopped abruptly. As if realizing she might be going too far, Claire gave a small, understanding laugh. I know you can't give me details, I'm just curious. My husband and I have been talking about whether Milo might have been stolen before we realized he was gone. I just want to make sure there's no mix-up. There was a pause, long enough for Claire to hear the faint tapping of computer keys. Then Melissa's voice came back, softer this time, almost conspiratorial. All I can say is, the name she gave matched the caller ID, and the last name sounded like Marston. That's M-R-S-T-O-N, if I'm spelling it right. She mentioned living out near County Road 12, past the old grain elevator. Claire's heart gave a hard, quick thud. That was more than she'd hoped for. She kept her voice steady. That's interesting, she said, as though filing away an idle fact. 2 towns over, isn't it? Just about, Melissa confirmed. It's a rural area, big properties, lots of open land. Not many people out there, but the ones who are tend to stay put. She hesitated, then added, I really shouldn't say more. Just if you go looking, be careful. I understand, Claire said gently. And thank you, Melissa. You've been so helpful. I'll see you next week." When the call ended, Claire sat very still, letting the new information settle. Marston County Road 12. 2 towns over, it was the first concrete location she'd had since Milo had been taken. She pulled her notebook closer, writing the name and address details in large, deliberate letters, underlining them twice. On her laptop, she brought up a map and searched the road. County Road 12 cut through farmland and open fields with long stretches between properties. She zoomed in until the satellite view showed individual houses, some modest, some sprawling, all separated by acres of land. If Karen Marston lived there, it would be easy to keep a dog out of sight. Claire clicked through the search results until she found a property listing from several years ago for a place on that road. The photos showed a 2-story farmhouse painted pale blue with a detached garage and a wide fenced yard. She pictured Milo running across that grass, chasing after a ball thrown by hands he didn't know. The image made her throat tighten. She copied the address into her notes, along with a reminder to verify it before doing anything impulsive. The urge to drive out there immediately was strong. But she knew she needed a plan, one that wouldn't risk scaring the woman into hiding him or claiming she had bought him legally without knowing the truth. Still, just having a name and a location changed everything. Milo wasn't a vague somewhere anymore. He was on a piece of land she could pinpoint on a map, in a house she could stand in front of if she wanted to. And now that she knew where to look, nothing Daniel had done, no decision he'd made without her consent, was going to keep her from bringing him home. The sun had barely lifted above the horizon when Claire pulled out of her driveway, the pale light spilling over the quiet street in long, golden lines. The morning air still held a trace of coolness, and the car's heater hummed softly as she turned onto the main road. In the passenger seat sat her worn leather notebook, the pages filled with names, addresses, and dates, every piece of the puzzle she had gathered over the past few days. At the top of the page was the one that mattered most now, County Road 12. The town was still waking up as she drove through, passing shuttered shop fronts and the occasional early riser walking a dog or carrying a cup of coffee. Each time she saw a golden retriever, her chest tightened, and her eyes flickered over the dog's gait, its coat, its markings, as if there were a chance Milo might be among them. But the shapes on the sidewalks were always strangers. Once she reached the highway, the scenery opened up into long stretches of farmland. The fields were lined with frost that glittered in the morning light, and the occasional barn stood like a dark silhouette against the pale sky. Claire's hands stayed tight on the steering wheel, her thoughts running in loops. She rehearsed how she would start the conversation if she met Karen face to face dot. "I think you might have my dog. There's been a mistake. I'm not here to cause trouble. I just want to see him." Each version played out in her head, shifting depending on whether she imagined Karen as a reasonable woman who had been misled or someone who might slam the door in her face. The problem was, she didn't know which version she would find. She tried to focus on the details she could control, the way she would introduce herself, the tone she would use. She told herself she would stay calm, that she wouldn't accuse. Anger could make the other woman defensive, and she couldn't afford to lose her only chance. But beneath that measured plan, hope and fear battled for space. Hope that she would see Milo, that his ears would perk and his tail would wag when he recognized her. Fear that he wouldn't be there at all, or worse, that he would be there and she wouldn't be able to take him home. The closer she got to the town, the narrower the road became. County Road 12 appeared as a turnoff marked by a weathered green sign. The paint faded from years of sun and wind. She slowed as she turned, the tires crunching over gravel. The road stretched ahead in a straight line, lined with fields on one side and dense trees on the other. The houses were spaced far apart, each one set back from the road with long driveways that curved toward porches or barns. She glanced at the numbers painted on mailboxes, counting down until she reached the one she had written in her notes. Her heartbeat quickened when she spotted it, a black metal box at the end of a gravel drive. The name Marston stenciled in white block letters. Beyond the mailbox, the pale blue farmhouse from the real estate listing stood among bare trees. A wide porch running along the front, the detached garage was closed, and a length of fencing stretched behind the house. Enclosing a yard she couldn't see clearly from the road, Claire pulled over to the side. Cutting the engine, but leaving the keys in her lap, she sat there for a long moment, watching the stillness of the property. No movement in the windows. No sound except the faint rustle of leaves in the wind. She tried to steady her breathing, pressing her palms against the steering wheel in her mind. She ran through her words one last time. She pictured Milo running toward her, the solid weight of him against her legs, the familiar warmth of his fur under her hands. She also pictured a closed door, a cold stare, and the possibility of being told to leave. When she finally opened the car door, the air was crisp and smelled faintly of wood smoke from somewhere down the road. Gravel shifted under her shoes as she stepped toward the driveway. Every part of her wanted to run the rest of the way, but she forced herself to walk slowly to keep her steps measured. She didn't know how this would end, only that she had to see it through. The gravel driveway crunched under Claire's shoes as she moved farther from the road, her breath clouding faintly in the cool morning air. The farmhouse loomed larger with every step, its pale blue paint clean and bright despite the seasons, where the porch railing was freshly painted white and a pair of rocking chairs sat side by side, angled toward the yard as though waiting for someone to sit with coffee and watch the day begin. There was a careful neatness to everything: the trimmed hedges along the path, the swept porch, the absence of clutter beyond the house. The land stretched wide. Fenced paddocks ran parallel to the property line, and within them she could see movement: two chestnut horses grazing with slow, deliberate bites, their tails flicking lazily at the flies. A small group of goats clustered near a weathered shed, their curious eyes following her as she walked. Somewhere farther back, a chicken clucked and flapped its wings, the sound sharp in the stillness. The place didn't feel neglected or chaotic. It felt lived in, maintained with care. She was halfway up the driveway when the first bark cut through the air. It was sharp, quick, the kind of sound that made her feet stop before her mind caught up. Her head turned toward the fenced area to the right of the house, but the fence was high, and the yard sloped slightly upward, blocking her view. Another bark followed, lower this time, and then a pause. Her pulse quickened. It had been days since she'd heard Milo's voice, and the memory of it felt both close and uncertain. Barking wasn't enough to be sure. She knew the danger of letting hope run ahead of the facts, but still, her heart leaned toward the sound, straining to catch a pattern, a familiar rhythm. The barking came again, followed by a series of short, excited yips from another dog. The mix of voices made it impossible to tell which, if any, belonged to him. She walked a few more paces, her eyes searching for a gap in the fence or a higher vantage point. The main gate was farther ahead, where a gravel turnoff led to the fenced yard. The barking grew louder as she neared it, the sounds overlapping, now one deep, one sharp, both pressing at the edges of her restraint. She could see the top of a dog's head for just a second, a flash of golden fur before it disappeared behind a wooden shed inside the enclosure. Her breath caught, but she forced herself to keep moving steadily instead of running toward it. The yard itself was generous in size, dotted with toys and shaded by an old oak whose bare branches reached wide. Two large food bowls sat near the fence, each half full, and a water trough gleamed in the morning light. She caught sight of a black and white border collie weaving quickly through the grass, its eyes fixed on her with alert curiosity. Barked again, pacing near the fence before trotting toward the shed. From behind the shed, another shape emerged. This one was lighter in color, taller, with a broad chest and a feathery tail that swayed slowly. It was far enough away that she couldn't be certain, but the outline pulled at something deep in her memory. The dog lifted its head, ears pricking, and barked once lower and rounder in tone than the collie's. She gripped the fence post nearest her, leaning forward slightly, trying to read every detail of the movement, the posture, the sound. Before she could get a clearer look, the dog turned away, trotting toward the far end of the yard. The collie followed, the two of them disappearing again behind the shed. The barking quieted, replaced by the muffled scrape of paws against grass and dirt. She realized her hands were clenched, nails pressing into her palms. From this distance, she couldn't call out "not" without alerting whoever was inside the house. She didn't know yet how she wanted that first encounter to go, and she wasn't ready to lose the element of quiet observation. Instead, she stayed where she was, letting her eyes sweep the property again, committing its details to memory. The horses had moved closer to the fence. The goats had wandered off toward the shed, and somewhere in the back, the chicken had gone silent. She listened for another bark, but only the faint rustle of wind through the oak branches reached her. Whether it was him or not, she couldn't say for certain. But the possibility was enough to keep her rooted to the spot, heart steadying itself for whatever came next. Claire had been standing near the fence for several minutes, trying to hear any sign of him again, when the sound of hinges groaning made her look toward the porch. The screen door swung open, and a woman stepped out, closing it behind her with deliberate care. She held a white mug in both hands, steam rising in thin threads. Her hair was silver, pulled neatly into a low braid, and she wore a quilted vest over a flannel shirt, the kind of layered clothing that spoke of early mornings outdoors. She didn't smile, but her face wasn't hostile, just watchful, as though weighing the scene before her. "Can I help you with something?" the woman asked. Her voice was calm, steady, and carried the tone of someone accustomed to being in control of their space. Claire took a breath, straightened her shoulders, and stepped closer along the gravel path. "My name is Claire," she said, careful to keep her tone even. "I believe you have my dog." The woman's eyes narrowed just enough to register a shift. "If you're talking about the golden retriever," she replied, "I purchased him. A man came to my house last week, said he was moving and couldn't keep the dog. I paid him in cash, got the paperwork, and took him in. It was a fair, legal sale." Claire's stomach tightened. "That man is my husband. He sold Milo without telling me. I never agreed to it. Milo is my dog. Guy raised him. I have all his adoption papers in my name. His microchip is registered to me." The woman shifted her mug to one hand and rested the other on the porch railing. "I'm sorry if there's some sort of personal dispute between you and your husband," she said, her voice still polite but firm. "But the fact is, he represented himself as the owner. I asked questions, saw the records, and got a bill of sale signed by him. I didn't do anything wrong." Claire moved closer, stopping at the first step. "He wasn't his to sell. I'm telling you the truth. I've had Milo since he was 8 weeks old. He's family. You have no idea what he means to me." The woman's face softened slightly, but her stance didn't change. "I can see you care about him, but I also know that when I bought him, I believed I was giving him a stable, loving home. He's adjusting here, running on the property, playing with my other animals. He's healthy, he's safe. It wouldn't be right to just hand him over." Without knowing the full story, Claire felt her voice waver with frustration, but she kept it steady. "The full story is that my husband decided to sell something that didn't belong to him. Milo isn't a piece of furniture you can just trade for cash. He's mine, and I'm here to bring him home." The woman took a slow sip from her mug. Before answering, "Even if that's true, I can't just give him back because you say so. I have no proof standing here. If you have legal documents, maybe a court can decide. But until then, he's staying here." A long silence hung between them. From somewhere behind the shed came the muffled sound of dogs barking again, one deeper than the other. Claire's chest tightened. She was almost certain it was him. "Is he here now?" she asked. The woman hesitated, then nodded once. "Yes, but I'm not going to let you take him. If you want to see him, that's something we can discuss. But I'm not making any promises." Claire's eyes didn't leave hers. "I'm not leaving without at least seeing him," she said quietly. The woman studied her for a moment longer, her expression unreadable, before turning toward the door. "Wait here," she said, disappearing inside. The screen door shut behind her, leaving Claire alone with the cold air, the quiet thump of her own heartbeat, and the hope that in a few moments she might be looking into Milo's eyes again. Claire waited until the house lights in her neighborhood went out, the quiet settling over the street like a heavy blanket. She had spent the rest of the day replaying the conversation on that porch, turning over every word the woman had said. Every guarded expression, her mind kept circling back to the muffled barking she'd heard behind the shed, the deep, familiar tone that had made her pulse race. She hadn't seen him, not once, but the sound alone had been enough to stir something, deep and certain, inside her. Still, she needed to know. She needed proof that it was truly Milo before she took her next step. She slipped on a dark jacket, tucked her hair into a knit cap, and grabbed her keys from the hook by the door. The drive felt longer this time, though the road was the same, winding stretch through farmland and darkened houses. Out here, the stars seemed sharper, the air colder. She drove with her headlights dimmed until she was near the property, then turned them off completely and coasted the car to a stop a good distance down the road. She didn't want to risk being seen. The house was faintly visible beyond the line of trees, its windows glowing soft amber in the night. A porch light spilled onto the gravel drive, but most of the yard lay in darkness. She stayed in the car for a few minutes, letting her eyes adjust, scanning for movement. The wind carried faint sounds, rustling leaves, the creak of a weather vane, and then, somewhere deeper on the property, a single bark. Her heart lurched. It came again, a short, eager sound she knew as well as her own name. Claire eased out of the car, careful to close the door without a sound. She moved along the edge of the road, keeping low, using the shadow of the fence to stay hidden. The closer she got, the more distinct the noises became, soft pawing against wood, the shuffle of movement, the occasional low whine. She could see the barn now, its sidewall catching the faintest light from the house. Near the back corner was a small fenced area, and in it, a shape shifted in the darkness. She crouched near the fence line, her breath slowing so she could listen. Another barked this time, then a high-pitched whimper. Claire swallowed hard. "Milo," she whispered, so low it was almost part of her breath. The shape stilled. She tried again, a little louder, calling him in the same gentle tone she'd used since he was a puppy. This time the sound that came back was frantic scramble of paws, the rattle of the fence, a soft whine that broke into an almost desperate bark. Her throat tightened. She couldn't see him clearly, but she didn't need to. No other dog moved like that when it heard her voice. No other dog answered her with that exact mix of urgency and joy. It was him. There was no question now. She crouched there for several minutes, whispering his name, letting the sound of her voice travel to him, hoping it told him she hadn't forgotten, that she hadn't given up. A light flicked on inside the barn, making her pull back into the shadows. The back door opened and the woman from the porch stepped out, wearing a heavy robe and holding a flashlight. She moved toward the fenced area, murmuring something to the dog. Milo's barking softened, but didn't stop, and Claire saw his golden coat catch the beam of the light for just a second. Her chest ached with the sight. The woman gave him a few pats, then guided him into the barn and closed the door. The light went out again, leaving only the hum of the night. Claire stayed crouched until she was sure the woman had gone back inside. Only then did she retreat the way she'd come, slipping back into her car, gripping the steering wheel with cold hands. She had her answer now. It was Milo, and he was here. And she knew with unshakable certainty that she would find a way to bring him home. Claire had been turning over possibilities in her mind for days, weighing the risk of another confrontation against the pull she felt to see him up close. She told herself she would go back in daylight, make her presence clear, and ask no to insist in being allowed near him. She rehearsed calm words on the drive out, knowing her voice could betray her if she let her emotions run ahead of her. The morning was bright, a thin winter sun casting pale gold over the frost-tipped grass. When she turned into the gravel lane, the house and its quiet orderliness seemed almost untouched by the tension that had taken root in her life. She parked at the edge of the driveway and stepped out, her breath visible in the crisp air. Porch door opened after only a brief knock, and the woman appeared, her eyes steady but unreadable. "You've come back," she said, her voice even neither surprised nor welcoming. Claire nodded. "I just want to see him," she replied. "One time I won't try to take him. I need to see him." The woman's gaze lingered on her for a long moment, as though measuring the truth in her words. At last, she stepped aside and gestured toward the yard. "Wait here!" Claire stood rooted in place, her heart quickening at the sound of a latch being undone somewhere beyond her sight. Then she heard Ita bark, sharp and eager, followed by the rapid rhythm of paws against the ground. A few seconds later, the woman came around the side of the house, holding a leash attached to a golden retriever who seemed almost too full of motion to contain himself. His coat shone in the sunlight. The familiar way his tail wagged was like a key turning in a lock she had feared would stay closed forever. The moment Milo's eyes landed on her, the world seemed to collapse into the space between them. His bark shifted to a high-pitched whine of recognition, and he lunged forward, the leash going taut in the woman's grip. Claire took a step closer without realizing it, her own breath catching. "Milo," she said softly, but the single word carried years of love, the weight of every walk, every night, curled together on the couch. every small ritual of life they had shared. He strained against the leash so hard that his front paws left the ground, tail beating wildly, his entire body a rush of joyful urgency. The woman braced herself to hold him back, but even she couldn't hide a flicker of surprise at his reaction. Claire knelt where she was, not wanting to push the fragile permission she'd been granted. She held her hands out, palms up, letting him see and smell her. The second his nose reached her fingertips, his whines deepened, and he pushed his head into her hands with such force it nearly knocked her off balance. She buried her face in his fur, breathing in the scent that was so achingly familiar. Warm, clean, touched with the faint trace of the outdoors. For a long moment, neither of them moved except for the small, desperate adjustments he made to stay. As close to her as possible, she whispered to him, telling him she had been looking for him every day, that she was going to make things right, that he was still hers. His ears flicked at the sound of her voice, his tail never slowing. When she finally looked up, the woman was watching closely. Her expression had shifted, less guarded, more thoughtful, but she didn't speak. She simply gave the leash a gentle tug, a signal that the visit was nearing its end. Claire nodded faintly, knowing this moment could vanish if she argued. She gave Milo one last long stroke down his back, memorizing the feel of his muscles under her hand, the warmth of him, as the woman led him away. Milo kept turning his head to look at her, whining softly until the distance pulled him out of view. Claire stood where she was, her hands still tingling from the contact, her heart pounding with both joy and a fresh wave of resolve. She had seen him, he had seen her, and that bond undeniable, unshaken, was going to be the thing that brought him home. Claire hadn't planned to bring it up that day, but the sight of Milo pressing himself into her hands had undone any careful pacing she'd intended. As the woman began to turn back toward the house, leading him with firm but not unkind tugs, Claire took a step forward. Her voice came out low but steady. "I want to buy him back." The words seemed to hang between them in the cold air, heavier than she expected. The woman paused mid-step, one hand tightening on the leash, and looked over her shoulder. "He's not for sale," she said simply, as though the matter were already closed. But Claire didn't move. She reached into her jacket pocket, pulled out the envelope she had stuffed there that morning, almost on instinct. "I can pay you more than what you gave my husband," she said, the word husband catching for just a fraction of a second before she forced herself to go on. "Cash, right now." She held the envelope up slightly, not waving it, but letting the weight of it be visible. The woman's expression didn't change much, but her shoulders lifted in a small sigh. "It's not about money," she replied. She looked down at Milo, who had stopped pulling against the leash and was now sitting obediently, though his eyes were still fixed on Claire. "He's settled here. He's part of our family now." Claire felt the words like a slap, though they were spoken without cruelty. "Part of your family?" she repeated, not raising her voice, but unable to keep the disbelief from it. "He's been with me since he was 8 weeks old. He knows my voice, my scent, my home. I'm his family." The woman's gaze softened slightly, but didn't waver. "Maybe that was true," she said, "but animals adapt. They move on faster than people do. He's happy here. He has space to run, other dogs to play with. We've put time into training him, bonding with him. I'm not taking that away from my kids." It was the first time she'd mentioned children. And Claire's eyes flicked toward the yard, imagining small hands gripping Milo's fur, little voices calling his name whatever name they'd given him now. The thought tangled with her anger, making it harder to speak. "I'm not asking to take him away without care for anyone else," she said slowly. "I'm offering to make it right. Whatever my husband told you, I didn't agree to this. He sold something that wasn't his to sell." The woman's jaw tightened just a bit at that. She shifted the leash from one hand to the other, then shook her head. "You need to take it up with him. My deal was with him, and as far as I'm concerned, it's done. I'm not going to hurt my family to fix a mistake in yours." Claire felt her grip on the envelope tighten. She could hear Milo's breathing, the soft click of his nails on the gravel as he shifted his weight, as if ready to spring toward her at the slightest slack in the leash. She thought about all the nights she had lain awake since he vanished, picturing him somewhere strange, wondering if he was warm, fed, safe. Now he was here, right in front of her, and the line between them was nothing but a strip of woven nylon in someone else's hand. "I'd take the best care of him," Claire said, her voice quieter now, almost a plea. Better than anyone. The woman looked at her for a long moment, then down at Milo, then back again. "I don't doubt that," she said finally, "but he's ours now. I won't change my mind." The finality in her tone left no room for another word. She turned toward the house again, and Milo strained once in Claire's direction before following reluctantly, his ears flat, tail low, but still wagging faintly. Claire stood there, envelope in hand, watching them disappear into the shadow of the porch. The refusal stung sharper than she'd expected, but beneath it, something solid began to form a quiet certainty that this wasn't the end of the conversation, even if it was the end of this one. Claire drove back into town with the refusal still echoing in her mind, every word from the woman at the rural property replaying itself on a loop. She had gone there thinking that money might bridge the gap, that she could undo her husband's decision in a single, straightforward transaction. Instead, she left with Milo's scent still on her hands and a sharp awareness that the buyer had no intention of letting him go. It wasn't just about convincing someone now, it was about finding a way to make it undeniable that he was hers. That night, she sat at the kitchen table with her laptop open, the glow of the screen cutting through the dim light. She typed out, "A search for dogs sold without owner's consent," and was met with a mess of articles, forum posts, and scattered advice. Most of it was emotional rather than legal people arguing over morality, telling stories that ended without resolution. But buried between opinion pieces and cautionary tales, she found something concrete: the contact information for a local attorney specializing in animal law. She hadn't even known such a field existed. The next morning, she called the number, half expecting to be told her situation was hopeless. Instead, the receptionist booked her for a consultation that afternoon. Claire arrived early, sitting in her car outside the small brick office until the clock on the dashboard finally turned. Over? Inside, the waiting room was quiet, lined with photographs of dogs and cats, some in show poses, others caught mid-run. When her name was called, she followed the assistant down a short hallway into an office with stacks of case files along the walls. The attorney, a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes and a calm voice, listened without interruption as Claire laid out the entire chain of events, from the moment she noticed Milo missing to the conversation on the property the day before. When she finished, the attorney leaned back in her chair. "First, you should know that pets are considered property under the law in this state," she began. "That means your husband had no right to sell him if you are a co-owner or the sole owner. The key will be proving that the sale was unauthorized and that you have a clear claim to him." Claire felt a flicker of hope at the words, "no right." She leaned forward. "How do I prove that?" "Documentation," the attorney said, sliding a legal pad closer. "Vet records in your name, adoption or purchase contracts, microchip registration, anything that ties him directly to you. If your name is the only one listed, it strengthens your case considerably. We'd also want to gather any evidence that the sale was made without your consent texts, emails, even witness statements." Claire thought of the years of vet visits, the receipts for training classes, the registration papers she kept in a folder at home. "I have all of that," she said. "Good," the attorney replied. "The next step is to formally request the return of the dog from the buyer, in writing, through this office. If she refuses, we can proceed with a replevin action. That's a legal claim to recover property unlawfully held. In court, you would present your proof of ownership and the lack of consent. If the judge rules in your favor, she would be compelled to return him." The idea of sitting in a courtroom to fight for Milo made Claire's stomach knot, but it also planted something steady in her on Avenue that didn't rely on someone's kindness or sense of fairness. She asked about the timeline, the costs, and whether the woman could fight back. The attorney explained that the process could take weeks or months, depending on how cooperative or uncooperative the other party was. "But you have a strong position," she said. "And if your husband admits he acted without your agreement, that's even stronger." Claire left the office with a list of documents to gather and a clearer sense of the road ahead. The sky outside had shifted to a muted gray, the first hints of winter pressing in. But the weight she'd carried since Milo vanished felt slightly lighter. She knew now that this was no longer a search conducted in the shadows. It was a matter to be handled in the open, with rules and structure. As she slid into the driver's seat, she could picture him again, the way he had pushed his head into her hands, his tail moving like it had a mind of its own. She would fight for that moment to be permanent, and now she had the map for how to do it. It wasn't quick, it wouldn't be easy, but it was a path and she was ready to take the first step. Claire began the next morning with a clear plan in her head. The attorney's list was folded neatly in her jacket pocket, but she didn't need to look at it to remember what it said. She had spent half the night mentally tracing through drawers, file boxes, and email folders, pinpointing where each piece of proof might be. If this was going to work, she needed to show without a shred of doubt that Milo was hers, and had always been. She started in the small office at the back of the house. A narrow cabinet stood against the wall, its drawers packed tight with years of life's paperwork. She pulled the top one open, the faint metallic scrape echoing in the quiet room. Inside were the organized files she'd labeled herself insurance, utilities, taxes. She slid them aside until she found the faded blue folder marked Milo. The sight of it brought a rush of emotion, and for a moment she had to steady her hands before opening it. Inside were the adoption papers from the breeder, dated and signed in her name alone, along with the receipt for the payment she'd made. All those years ago, she laid them carefully on the desk, then flipped through the rest records from his first vaccinations, each card with her address printed clearly. There were receipts for training sessions, invoices from the groomer, and pages of medical history from the vet. Her name was on every line that mattered. From there, she moved to the drawer in the hallway where she kept pet supplies. In a small tin box, she found the microchip registration card. The number was still clear on the sticker, and below it, the registration date matched the week after she'd brought him home. She remembered taking him in, how he'd flinched slightly at the quick pinch, and how the vet had smiled, saying it was the best step she could take to ensure he'd always find his way back. That small plastic card now felt like one of the most important things she owned. She turned to her phone next, scrolling back through messages and photos. She knew she didn't have anything from her husband explicitly saying he had no claim to Milo. It had never occurred to her they'd need such proof. But what she did have was a long thread of conversations with friends and family, all showing her as Milo's sole caretaker. Messages about vet appointments she was taking him to, photos she'd sent after a new haircut, videos of him playing in the yard. In one thread with her sister, she found a conversation from a year ago where she mentioned paying for a surgery with her own savings. That, she thought, would help show the court that she alone had been responsible for his welfare. She also remembered a brief exchange with her husband from a few months before the sale. She had texted him asking if he could feed Milo that evening, because she'd be late at work, and he'd replied, "I don't even know where you keep the food." She took a screenshot of it, noting the date. It wasn't proof of ownership in the strictest sense, but it spoke to how little involvement he had in Milo's care. By late afternoon, the desk was covered with papers, cards, and printed screenshots. Claire arranged them into neat piles: adoption and purchase records, medical history, microchip registration, caretaker evidence. Each piece was a small slice of the life she and Milo had shared, ordinary in isolation but powerful together. She placed them in a large envelope, labeling it with her name and the case reference the attorney had given her. As the light outside began to fade, she sat back and looked at the gathered evidence. These were not just documents, they were the record of years of love, responsibility, and commitment. Every date, every signature, every line of her name was another thread tying Milo back to her. She could almost feel him beside her as she worked, the warmth of his head resting against her leg. When she finally sealed the envelope, she felt something shift inside her. The search for him had started with frantic calls and unanswered questions, but now it was becoming something different. She was no longer chasing shadows, she was building a case, brick by brick, to bring him home for good. Claire had expected her husband to be difficult, but the level of resistance he showed caught her off guard. When she first approached him about the documents and receipts, she kept her voice even, asking for his help as if this were simply a shared problem they needed to solve. She explained that the attorney would need any paperwork he might have, even something as small as a text or receipt from the sale. She hoped that framing it as a matter of clearing things up might get him to hand something over. Instead, he crossed his arms and leaned back in his chair, his expression hardening in that way she had come to recognize over the years. "I told you already. I sold him to help with bills," he said flatly. "There's nothing else to it." She asked for details: the buyer's full name, the date, any written agreement, but he gave short, vague answers, and some of them didn't match what she already knew. When she pointed out the inconsistencies, he became defensive. "You're twisting my words," he said, shaking his head. "I'm not the one making this into a drama." It was obvious now that he wasn't simply uninterested in helping. He was actively trying to control the narrative. He began telling anyone who asked about Milo that she had been fine with the decision, that they had both agreed it was the best thing to do at the time. The first time she heard this, it was from a mutual friend who called to ask why she was going to such lengths to get the dog back if she had already agreed to the sale. Claire felt a tightness in her chest, realizing just how quickly a false version of events could take hold. At home, his resistance took on a quieter but more cutting form. If she brought up Milo's name, he would sigh and leave the room, muttering that she was obsessing. He accused her of caring more about a dog than about their marriage, framing her determination as selfishness. More than once, he suggested that the money from the sale had gone toward things for the household, implying that she should be grateful rather than angry. Each time, she wanted to point out that she had seen no such expenses, but arguing only seemed to make him dig in deeper. One evening, after another failed attempt to get straight answers from him, she sat alone in the kitchen and went over what she had. The attorney had told her that his cooperation could help but wasn't necessary if she had enough independent proof. Still, she knew his lies could slow the process, and that, in court, his testimony could complicate things if she didn't prepare for it. She began to keep a record of every conversation they had about Milo, writing down his exact words while they were still fresh in her mind. If he claimed something she could disprove, she noted it alongside the evidence that contradicted him. Slowly, she was building not just a case for ownership, but a record of his shifting story. It hurt more than she wanted to admit to see how far he was willing to go to protect his version of events. This wasn't the kind of stubbornness she'd seen before in minor disagreements. This was calculated. He seemed more concerned with saving face than with telling the truth, even if that meant standing in the way of bringing Milo home. But Claire refused to let his resistance define the outcome. If anything, it made her more determined. She would keep gathering what she needed, document every inconsistency, and let the facts speak when the time came. His lies might cloud the air for now, but she knew that in the end, the truth had a way of settling back into place. The only question was how long it would take and how far she would have to go to get there. The envelope was thick, its weight carrying more than just paper. Claire had watched the process server slide it into his bag earlier that morning, his manner brisk and professional. He had explained the route he would take, the property where he would leave it if the woman refused to come to the door, and the fact that once it was in her hands or left at her residence it would count as served. Claire had nodded, her palms damp despite the cool air drifting through the open window. This was the point where the search for Milo shifted from a private battle to a matter recorded in legal ink by late afternoon. The call came through. The process server's voice was calm, almost routine, as he confirmed the job was done. She answered. He said, took the envelope without a word. I explained what it was. She read the top page before closing the door. Claire thanked him, her voice steady, though her heartbeat had picked up. She set the phone down on the table and sat for a moment, letting the reality sink in. The buyer now knew that Milo's ownership was being formally contested, that Claire was no longer just the woman who showed up on her driveway asking questions, but the petitioner in a legal case that could compel her to return him. She imagined the scene, the polite but firm woman from before, standing in her doorway, flipping through the first few pages to see Claire's name alongside hers in a document stamped with a county court seal. The details would be laid out plainly: dates, microchip registration, veterinary records, the claim that the sale had been without her consent. It was all there in black and white, a direct challenge to her claim of being Milo's rightful owner. Evening, Claire's phone buzzed again, this time with a message from an unfamiliar number. The tone was sharper than the buyer's face-to-face politeness had been. The message accused her of harassment, of wasting the court's time, and insisted that Milo was loved and cared for where he was. Claire read it twice before setting the phone down. The attorney had warned her this might happen, that serving papers could provoke anger or even threats of counteraction. She reminded herself that the buyer's feelings weren't the point. The point was to bring Milo home, Still, the weight of the step she'd taken was heavy. This was no longer just between her, the buyer, and her husband. It was something that would unfold in hearings, with a judge reading through exhibits and listening to arguments. There would be deadlines, filings, perhaps even testimony. And while she believed her case was strong, she also knew that court cases were rarely as straightforward as they appeared on paper. She spent the rest of the night organizing her evidence again, labeling each piece clearly so it could be referenced. Quickly, the attorney had told her they would soon receive the buyer's official response, and that it would likely include her own claims of ownership and care. Claire imagined what those might look like: photos of Milo on the property, visits since the sale, perhaps even testimonials from neighbors saying he seemed happy there. She knew she would have to be ready to counter each one with proof of her own dot in the quiet of the house. With the papers spread out before her, Claire thought back to the first time she'd seen Milo, a small bundle of fur with bright eyes that had met hers without hesitation. That moment had been the beginning of a promise, even if she'd never put it into words. Serving the papers wasn't about punishing anyone. It was about keeping that promise. Now, the process was in motion. The buyer could no longer pretend this was a closed matter. Whether in days or weeks, they would face each other again, but this time it would be across a courtroom with the truth laid out between them for someone else to decide. It began with a single post on a local community forum, written by a friend who had watched Claire's search unfold quietly for weeks. The friend shared a photo of Milo from before he was taken here, perked eyes, alert, sitting on the old plaid blanket he loved, and a short explanation of what had happened. It wasn't an angry tirade, just a factual account. A beloved dog sold without the owner's consent, now in the possession of someone who refused to give him back, and a court case underway to bring him home. Within an hour, the thread had dozens of comments. By the end of the day, it had hundreds. Neighbors who had once only waved from a distance began showing up at her door, asking if there was anything they could do. Some offered to help with legal costs, slipping folded bills or small envelopes into her hand before she could refuse. Others shared stories of their own pets, lost, found, or taken, and how they had fought to bring them home. It wasn't just sympathy. There was a shared sense of injustice that seemed to strike a nerve with people from all walks of life. One woman from across town dropped by with a printed list of local animal rescues and legal aid resources she thought might help. A man Claire barely knew offered to testify in court if needed, saying he remembered seeing Milo with her nearly every morning on his drive to work. A retired couple 2 streets over baked her bread and told her to keep her strength up. It was a steady trickle of gestures that began to form a quiet network around her. Online, the reach of the story grew. Friends shared the post beyond the town's borders, and soon messages began arriving from strangers, people in other cities, even other states, sending encouragement or advice. One former animal control officer wrote to explain how microchip records were handled in disputes, giving her ideas to strengthen her evidence. A woman from another state who had gone through a similar case told her what to expect when the other side tried to stall proceedings. Claire hadn't expected the swell of attention. At first, she was wary, worried that too much visibility might make the buyer more defensive. But as the days passed, she saw how the support was changing her own resolve. Where before she had felt like she was fighting alone, now there was a small but growing crowd behind her, reinforcing the idea that she wasn't unreasonable for wanting Milo back, that she was doing what anyone in her position should. Coffee shops started keeping a jar on the counter labeled "Bring Milo Home." Customers dropped in loose change or small bills, and the barista told her they'd pass it along when she came in next. Even the owner of the hardware store, who had a reputation for being gruff, quietly told her he had a cousin who worked in the county records office and might be able to help pull archived licensing information. If it was needed for court, it wasn't about money or favors so much as it was about having people believe her. Each conversation, each nod of understanding, chipped away at the weight of isolation she had been carrying since the day Milo disappeared. She began keeping a notebook, not just for evidence anymore, but to jot down the names of people who had offered to help. The most surprising moment came at the grocery store, when a stranger tapped her on the shoulder. The woman introduced herself and said she'd been following the story online. She explained that years ago, her own dog had been taken during a messy breakup, and she'd never gotten him back. Fight for him. the woman said softly. "Don't. Stop, no matter how much it wears you down. You'll regret it if you do." Claire walked home that day with her groceries, and the weight of the words still in her mind. The legal battle was still ahead, and nothing about it would be simple. But the community's presence, neighbors, friends, and strangers bound by a shared understanding of what it meant to lose something irreplaceable, was beginning to fill in the space where her strength had been wearing thin. It didn't change the facts of the case, but it reminded her of something just as important. She wasn't in this alone anymore. The courthouse was smaller than she expected, its hallways lined with faded photographs of local judges from decades past. Claire sat on a wooden bench outside the courtroom, the file folder resting in her lap. Inside, it was everything she had gathered over the past week's vet records: microchip registration, photographs spanning years, and printouts of text messages between her and her husband that left no doubt she had been Milo's sole caretaker. Her attorney sat beside her, quietly reviewing his notes. The low hum of voices from other cases filled the corridor, but her mind was fixed on a single thought. In a few minutes, she would have to speak. When the bailiff called the case, they stepped into the room. The space was formal, but not intimidating rows of wooden pew-like benches for observers, a raised bench for the judge, and a pair of tables facing forward. Claire and her attorney took their seats at one table, while the buyer sat at the other. Her hands folded, a man who appeared to be her own lawyer at her side. The judge glanced over the file before her and asked both sides to proceed. Claire's attorney began with a clear outline of the case. The dog, named Milo, had been in her care since he was a puppy. The husband had sold him without her knowledge or consent. The buyer had refused to return him despite being informed of the circumstances. And now, legal determination of ownership was necessary. He placed the vet records before the judge, pointing out the dates and the fact that every appointment, payment, and signature belonged to Claire. When it was her turn to testify, she rose slowly and walked to the witness stand. Her hands gripped the edge of the wooden rail as she was sworn in. The attorney began with simple questions: how long she had owned Milo, how she had cared for him, the routines they shared. She answered steadily, even when her voice tightened, describing the day she came home to find him gone. She spoke about the calls to shelters, the late-night drive to the buyer's property, the moment Milo recognized her. Then the questioning turned to her husband's actions. She described how he had admitted to selling Milo to help with bills, how there had been no discussion beforehand, no chance for her to object. When her attorney presented text messages where the husband acknowledged the sale, the judge read them carefully, underlining sections with a pen. The buyer's attorney asked his own questions, focusing on the idea that Milo was now settled in a new home and well cared for. He asked if Claire had proof of neglect or harm while Milo was with the buyer. She answered truthfully that she had none, but clarified that the issue was not neglected, was that the sale itself was unauthorized. Her voice was calm but firm. Then came the evidence about her husband. Her attorney introduced bank statements showing the money from the sale deposited into his personal account, used not for bills as he claimed, but for unrelated purchases. It painted a clear picture. The decision had not been about family finances. It had been about his own gain. When all the evidence was presented, the judge took a moment to look through the file again. The courtroom was silent, except for the turning of pages. Claire could feel her pulse in her fingertips as she waited. The judge then spoke, acknowledging that the microchip registration, veterinary records, and financial history all pointed to her as Milo's legal owner. The fact that the sale was conducted without her consent, combined with the husband's misuse of the proceeds, weighed heavily against any claim of legitimacy. The buyer's attorney requested a continuation to present additional arguments, and the judge agreed to set a final decision for a later date. It was not the swift resolution Claire had hoped for, but it was also not a defeat. As she gathered her papers, she noticed the judge had kept certain documents separate from the rest of evidence she knew was strongest in her favor. Walking out into the cool air of the courthouse steps, she felt the mix of exhaustion and cautious optimism. The fight wasn't over, but the truth had been laid out for the court to see, and now it was only a matter of time before the final judgment would decide if Milo could come home. The final day in court arrived with a pale, overcast sky that seemed to press low over the small courthouse. Claire sat at the same table as before, her file folder neatly stacked in front of her, though by now she knew its contents by heart. The buyer was there too, wearing the same composed expression she had carried through the earlier proceedings. The air inside was heavy with quiet anticipation. Even the usual murmurs in the gallery were muted, as though everyone sensed this was the moment the weeks of testimony, evidence, and cross-examination had been building toward. The judge entered, her black robe swaying slightly as she took her seat. She adjusted her glasses and opened a folder that was thicker than it had been at the start of the case. Claire could see her own handwriting on some of the documents inside the vet records and microchip papers she had provided. The judge began by reviewing the procedural history of the matter. A claim of wrongful sale of property in this case, a living animal brought forward by the original owner against a purchaser who had acquired the dog. From the plaintiff's spouse without her consent, she recounted the key points. Claire's documented history as the sole caregiver and financial provider for the dog since he was a puppy. The husband's unilateral decision to sell him. The payment trail showing the proceeds used for personal purchases unrelated to household needs, and the buyer's refusal to return the dog after being informed of the circumstances. There was no rush in her voice. She spoke slowly, with deliberate pauses, as though making sure each word was clear to everyone in the room. Claire sat completely still, her hands pressed together under the table. Every fact the judge repeated sounded like an affirmation of what she had known all along, yet she didn't allow herself to feel relief too soon. She had learned over these long weeks that nothing was certain until the final words were spoken. When the judge turned to the legal reasoning, her tone became more formal. She noted that while the law recognized animals as personal property for the purposes of ownership disputes, it also considered the manner in which a transfer occurred. A spouse could not legally sell jointly acquired property without the consent of the other, and in cases where the property in question could be shown to have been acquired and maintained solely by one party, the claim to ownership was even stronger. The judge cited the evidence from the veterinary clinic showing every medical record and payment in Claire's name. She mentioned the microchip registration, which had never been updated and still listed Claire as the primary and only contact. She addressed the husband's testimony, pointing out inconsistencies and the lack of credible proof that the sale had been intended to address shared financial needs. Then, finally, she delivered the ruling. The court found that the sale of the dog had been invalid. The husband had no legal authority to sell property he did not own. The buyer, while perhaps acting without knowledge of the dispute at the time of purchase, had no legal claim to retain the dog once the facts were established. The judge ordered that the dog be returned to Claire within 72 hours. There was no outburst of noise, just the soft scrape of chairs as people shifted in their seats. Claire's attorney placed a hand lightly on her shoulder and gave a small nod. Across the room, the buyer's expression tightened. Her lips pressed into a thin line, but she said nothing. The judge's words hung in the air like the closing of a door. Final and unarguable, Claire's pulse was unsteady as she rose and followed her attorney out into the hallway. It felt unreal, as though she were still rehearsing the moment in her head. But the court's order was clear. In a matter of days, Milo would be back where he belonged. The weeks of searching, gathering evidence, and standing in court had led to this unofficial acknowledgement that what had been done was wrong, and that it could be made right. Outside, the sky had begun to break. Thin streams of sunlight cutting through the clouds. She stood for a moment on the courthouse steps, letting the cool air fill her lungs. It wasn't joy she felt yet. Not exactly. It was something steadier, like the slow return of balance after being tilted off-center for too long. The fight was over. Now all that remained was to bring Milo home. The courthouse parking lot was nearly empty by the time Claire stepped outside again. The late afternoon sun had shifted low, casting long shadows that stretched across the cracked pavement. She clutched the folded copy of the judge's order. In one hand, the edges already softening from the way she kept pressing her fingers into it. Her attorney had walked with her as far as the front steps, then wished her luck and told her to call if anything came up during the transfer. Now, standing alone, she scanned the rows of parked cars. Uncertain how the moment would unfold, a white SUV turned in from the street, moving slowly toward the far side of the lot. Even before it parked, Claire recognized the woman driving. In the back seat, Through the glare on the window, she saw a shape shifting and passing a familiar outline. She had replayed in her mind hundreds of times since that first terrible day. Her chest tightened, her breath caught halfway, and she began walking before the car had fully stopped. The buyer stepped out, her face unreadable, one hand holding the end of a thick, braided leash. And then he appeared, Milo, tail whipping in a frantic arc, ears pulled forward, eyes locked on her with a recognition that cut through every mile, every day of absence. He let out a sharp bark, then another, the leash straining in the woman's hand. Claire stopped a few paces away, afraid that if she moved too quickly, the moment might fracture into something unreal. The woman hesitated. Glancing once at the folded paper Claire held, there was no small talk, no attempt to stretch the exchange. She knelt briefly, unhooked the clasp from Milo's collar, and let the leash fall. Milo didn't need another signal. He launched forward in a full sprint, nails clicking against the pavement before they found purchase in the patch of grass at the lot's edge. Claire dropped to her knees just in time for him to barrel into her, the force nearly knocking her backward. His weight was solid against her, his head burrowing into her shoulder, the familiar scent of his coat hitting her like a rush. She felt the rapid thud of his heartbeat under her hands, matching the quick staccato of her own. He whined in short bursts, as if trying to compress months of separation into a few desperate sounds, then pulled back just enough to lick her chin and press forward again. Claire kept one arm wrapped tightly around him while the other moved over. His fur, checking for the things her mind had feared: thinness, matted patches, anything to suggest neglect. But he felt strong, his coat soft and warm under her fingers. Whatever else had happened, he was here now, pressed against her like he had no intention of moving. They stayed like that for a long moment, the outside world reduced to the warmth of his body and the uneven rhythm of his breathing. She murmured his name over and over, the way she used to when they were alone in the quiet of the house. Each time his ears twitched as if in confirmation. He knew her voice. He had never forgotten. The woman who had brought him stood a few feet away, arms crossed, her gaze fixed somewhere over Claire's shoulder. When Claire finally rose, still holding Milo close, she gave a short nod of acknowledgement. It wasn't gratitude, exactly more the recognition that the matter was finished. Without another word, she returned to her car and drove off, leaving Claire and Milo standing in the warm stretch of late sunlight. Claire looked down at him, and he looked up. In return, his tail still sweeping side to side. She opened the back door of her car, and he jumped in without hesitation, circling once before, settling into the seat as though it had been waiting for him all along. She slid in beside him for a moment before starting the engine, resting her hand on his back. For the first time in months, she didn't have to imagine the feel of him beside her. He was here. And this time, she wasn't letting go. The drive home was quiet, except for the occasional rustle of Milo shifting in the back seat. He seemed content just to be near her again, resting his head against the window and watching the world pass by. Claire kept glancing at him in the rearview mirror, her chest tightening each time she caught his eyes. She had played this scene over in her mind countless times, but now that it was real, it carried a heavier weight. They were going home, but home was not the same place it had been before. When she pulled into the driveway, the house looked unchanged, the same front porch, the same flower bed she had tended that morning before everything had begun months ago. But there was an unfamiliar stillness in the air, as if the walls themselves knew that the balance inside had shifted. Milo bounded up the steps, tail wagging, eager to cross the threshold he hadn't seen in so long. She opened the door and let him in, watching as he sniffed each corner, tail swishing faster when he recognized old scents. His bed was still in the living room, untouched since the day he'd been taken, and he circled it once before, curling up as if no time had passed at all. Her husband was in the kitchen when she walked in, leaning against the counter with a glass in his hand. The sound of Milo's nails clicking against the floor made him glance up sharply. For a moment, neither of them spoke. His eyes went from Claire to the dog and back again, as though trying to piece together how this had happened. "You actually went through with it," he said finally, his tone hovering between disbelief and something sharper. Claire set her bag down on the table and met his gaze evenly. "I told you I would," he shook his head. letting out a low whistle. "All this for a dog?" Her jaw tightened, but her voice stayed calm. "For my dog, for the animal you sold without asking me, for the living, breathing friend who trusted me." She didn't raise her voice, but each word landed with a finality that filled the space between them. He looked down at his glass, swirling the contents slowly, as if the movement might help him find a response. "I thought it was helping us," he muttered. "You thought about yourself," she corrected. "You didn't think about me or him. You made a choice that wasn't yours to make." She leaned against the opposite counter, crossing her arms. "That's over now. Things are going to be different." He glanced at her, eyebrows lifting slightly. "Different how?" "Boundaries," she said. "From now on, you don't make decisions about things that belong to me. You don't speak for me. And if you try, you'll find yourself on the wrong side of more than just a court case." There was a long pause as he studied her, perhaps trying to decide whether she meant it. She let the silence stand, unblinking, until he looked away. The tension in the room was thick, but for the first time in months, she didn't feel like she was the one carrying all of it. Milo padded into the kitchen, sitting between them, his head tilting as if sensing the shift in tone. Claire reached down, running her hand over his back. "He's staying with me," she said quietly. "That's not up for debate." Her husband nodded once, though the motion was slow and reluctant. "I guess I underestimated how far you'd go," he said, almost under his breath. Claire straightened, her hand still resting on Milo's fur. "Don't make that mistake again." The rest of the evening unfolded in a kind of uneasy quiet. She fed Milo, sat with him on the couch, and let the television play in the background while she stroked his fur. Her husband stayed mostly in his office, the muted click of his keyboard the only sign of his presence. Every so often she caught him looking toward the living room, his expression unreadable. But he didn't say another word about Milo, and she didn't invite conversation. By the time she went to bed, Milo was curled at her feet, his steady breathing a comfort she had missed more than she'd realized. The fight wasn't gone from the house. There were things between her and her husband that would never return to what they'd been, but her dog was home. And that, she thought as she drifted toward sleep, was the line she had drawn and kept. The days that followed settled into a strange rhythm. Milo seemed to sense her need for calm, staying close without demanding too much. She took longer walks with him than before, letting the air clear her thoughts, her hand absently stroking the fur between his ears as they moved along familiar paths. Inside the house, her husband kept his distance. He didn't try to apologize, nor did he revisit the subject of the court case. It was as if they were both waiting for the other to make the next move. A silent standoff stretched across the walls they shared. It was during one of those long walks that the thought began to take shape, not as a sudden revelation, but as a slow, undeniable truth. What he had done wasn't just about Milo. It was about trust, or rather, the absence of it. The sale of her dog without her consent had been shocking, but when she looked at it alongside all the smaller incidents, the bank account decisions made without her, the messages deleted from her phone when she'd left it charging, the quiet dismissals of her concerns, it was clear this was part of a much larger pattern. It wasn't about one act of betrayal. It was about a way of living that had never truly included her. Back home, she began moving through the rooms differently. She started opening drawers and cabinets with a purpose, quietly taking stock of what was hers, what she would take, and what she could leave behind. She didn't speak of it to anyone yet, not even to her closest friend, who had been her sounding board throughout the fight to get Milo back. This wasn't a plan to announce. It was one to build quietly, step by step, until it was ready. At night, she found herself lying awake long after the lights were off, listening to the soft hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the house. She would glance at Milo, curled up on his bed beside hers, and feel a kind of clarity she hadn't allowed herself before. She thought about the future, not the vague, distant version she and her husband had once spoken about, but something concrete, practical, and hers alone. She began making lists in her mind, the names of attorneys she could contact, the apartments she might visit, the arrangements she would need to make for Milo during the move. Her husband, for his part, seemed to notice the shift, even if he didn't name it. He watched her more closely, his eyes following her when she left a room or took a phone call in private. Once, as she came in from a walk, he asked lightly if she'd been planning another legal surprise. She didn't answer. Instead, she hung up her coat and went to the kitchen to feed Milo. That was the first time she realized she no longer felt the need to defend herself to him. Weeks passed, and her preparations became more deliberate. She moved personal papers into a locked box she kept in the trunk of her car. She started selling a few items online, things he would never notice missing, but that would give her a cushion of cash when she needed it. She opened a separate bank account in her name alone, depositing small amounts she could explain if questioned. Each step was small enough not to raise alarm, but together they built the framework of her exit. There were moments of doubt, of course. Some evenings, she would watch him from across the room, remembering the years before the tension, when they'd shared plans and laughter. But those memories felt like they belonged to someone else's life. The man who had once been her partner had shown her, in the most undeniable way, that her trust was expendable to him. The court victory had brought her dog back, but it hadn't repaired what had been broken between them. One night, as she sat with Milo on the porch, the air cooled, and still, she whispered her decision out loud for the first time. "We're going to leave," she told him, her voice steady. He shifted closer, resting his head against her leg, and she felt an odd sense of peace in saying it. The decision was made, and now all that remained was the follow-through. She knew it wouldn't be easy. There would be questions, resistance, and perhaps attempts to change her mind. But the woman who had fought for Milo through legal filings, courtroom testimonies, and months of uncertainty wasn't the same woman who had once hesitated to stand her ground. She had learned exactly how far she was willing to go. For what mattered to her hand, she knew this was no different. When she finally rose to go back inside, she felt lighter, as if the path ahead had been cleared of the debris she had been stepping. Over 4 years, the plan was no longer just in her head. It was real, and it was only a matter of time before she would act on it. The day she left was quiet, almost deliberately so. There were no slammed doors or shouted farewells. Just the sound of her car pulling away from the driveway, with Milo sitting upright in the back seat. She had packed over the past few weeks fit neatly into the trunk and back seat. A careful selection of the things she needed and a few items that held meaning. She didn't look back at the house. She'd already decided that part of her life was over, and there was no use giving it a last glance that might invite hesitation. The small rental was on the edge of town. That gave it a feeling of privacy. The building itself was unremarkable, a single story, with faded blue siding and a narrow porch, but it was hers. Inside, the walls were painted a soft cream, the floors a warm honey-colored wood that creaked gently underfoot. There was a faint scent of lavender from the previous tenant, and for the first time in months, she felt as if she could exhale fully. Friends had offered to help her move, and by midday a small group had arrived, bringing folding chairs, potted plants, and bags of groceries. The kitchen quickly filled with the clatter of dishes being unpacked and the hum of casual conversation. Someone lit a candle on the counter, and the faint glow softened the sharp edges of the unfamiliar space. Milo wandered from room to room, sniffing corners, and occasionally glancing back at her as if to confirm they were staying. She chose the smallest bedroom for herself, leaving the larger one for a workspace and storage. Ground, dressed simply in white sheets and a light quilt. She set Milo's bed beside it, within easy reach of her hand, when she turned out the light at night. It was a modest setup, but every detail had been chosen without compromise or argument. That was the difference that struck her most. There was no one questioning why she wanted the furniture arranged a certain way. No one second-guessing her purchases or offering a better idea that suited them instead. In the evenings, friends stopped by with takeout containers and bottles of wine. Conversations drifted from the day's errands to stories about the past. But they never lingered on the subject of her marriage unless she brought it up herself. They understood that this wasn't about dwelling on what had happened, but about quietly shaping what came next. Outside, the neighborhood was calm. Children played in the afternoons, their laughter carrying through open windows, and older couples tended to small gardens in front of their porches. On her first weekend there, a neighbor she hadn't met before brought over a loaf of bread wrapped in a cloth, introducing herself with a warm smile and a promise to share more from her kitchen. It was a simple gesture, but it grounded her in a way she hadn't expected. With each passing day, the routines began to settle. Morning walks with Milo took them along tree-lined streets where the air felt lighter, freer. She began cooking again, something she'd stopped enjoying in the months before leaving. At night, she read in bed without the tension of anticipating a sharp word or an unspoken criticism. The quiet was different. Now it wasn't the silence of avoidance, but the kind that comes from being at ease in one's own space. She didn't think of this place as permanent, but as a step. It was where she could rebuild without pressure, surrounded by people who wanted nothing from her except to see her do well. Milo seemed to feel it too, his energy brighter, his eyes more alert, same steady gaze he'd given her during the hardest moments, as if recognizing that they had made it through together. One evening, after the last box had been unpacked and the kitchen shelves neatly organized, she sat on the porch with Milo. At her feet, the sky was fading into shades of pink and blue, the air cool enough to carry the scent of pine from the nearby woods. She thought about how far she'd come, not just in distance, but in the quiet decisions that had brought her here. Would still be challenges ahead, but for now, she had what she needed: safety, space, and the steady companionship of the dog she had fought so hard to keep. When the porch light flickered on automatically, she stayed a while longer, letting the calm settle around her. It wasn't the life she had once imagined, but it was a life she had chosen for herself that made all the difference. The morning light spilled across the floor in the same way it had months ago, slanting through the narrow gap in the curtains and stretching into soft golden lines across the wooden boards. The kettle began its low hum in the kitchen, and somewhere in the quiet, Milo shifted on his bed, stretching with a deep sigh before padding toward her. She sat at the small table by the window, her hands wrapped around a mug that was warm but not yet too hot to hold. Outside, the neighborhood was beginning to stir, an occasional car passing, the distant bark of a dog, the faint clatter of someone rolling their trash bin to the curb. It could have been any ordinary morning. The same rituals unfolded without thought, turning on the kettle, letting Milo outside into the fenced yard, scooping his breakfast into the bowl. The same light, the same pace, even the same mug she had favored before. But the difference was in the air itself, in the ease with which she moved. The tension that once knotted in her shoulders before she even opened her eyes was gone. There was no need to listen for footsteps in the hallway or anticipate the mood that might greet her. The house belonged entirely to her, and the silence was her own. Milo returned from the yard with his fur damp from the grass, tail wagging lazily. He nudged her leg with his nose, just as he always had, before curling up at her feet while she ate a piece of toast. She reached down absent-mindedly to scratch the spot behind his ear, the one that made him lean into her hand. That small act, repeated 100 times before, felt like a thread tying this morning to the hundreds of mornings she'd dreamed of having again. The mornings where nothing was missing. The kitchen smelled faintly of coffee and the lavender candle she had lit the night before. Sunlight moved slowly across the countertop, catching the rim of a glass and scattering a brief flicker of light on the wall. She noticed these things now in a way she hadn't before. Back then, the mornings had felt rushed, unsettled, sometimes edged with the kind of quiet that wasn't peaceful, but wary. Now she could stand still and listen without waiting for the sound of a door opening or a voice breaking the moment. She took her time finishing breakfast, letting the warmth of the coffee sink in. Milo lay on his side, head resting on his paws, his breathing steady and slow. She thought of all the mornings she'd woken before, immediately aware of what had been lost, her mind replaying the moment she'd found his bed empty. That sharp ache had been her first thought for weeks, lingering long after she'd left the table. Now there was nothing but the steady rhythm of their shared space. Outside, the air was cool when she stepped onto the porch. The grass still held a thin layer of dew, and a soft breeze moved through the trees, carrying the faint scent of pine. Milo trotted to the end of the yard, pausing to watch a squirrel dart across the fence before returning to her side. They walked the short loop around the block, the same route they had taken in the old neighborhood, but here it felt different. Neighbors waved as they passed, their greetings light and without curiosity. There was no undercurrent of whispered judgments, no sideways glances that made her want to quicken her pace. Back inside, she opened the windows to let the breeze move through the rooms. The curtains shifted gently, and the sound of leaves outside mixed with the distant laughter of children on their way to school. She stood for a while in the doorway of the living room, looking at the small space they had made their own: a worn sofa, a low bookshelf, Milo's bed tucked into the corner. None of it was extravagant, but each piece belonged there for a reason. By the time she sat back at the table, the sunlight had shifted, spilling across Milo's fur, where he now lay dozing in the warmth. She felt the kind of certainty that came, not from grand declarations, but from 1,000 small choices made for her own well-being. The morning was just a morning, but it was free of strain, unmarked by the constant weighing of another person's needs over her own. The light in the room was the same. The steps of the routine were the same. But now, every part of it felt like hers. And that made it entirely different.